Hi, let's get started on our next lecture, mad cow disease. Mad cow disease is a very common term used to describe a disease known more scientifically as BSE. BSE stands for bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Humans can also catch this disease, and when they catch this disease, it's referred to as CJD, or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Sheep can develop something similar called scrapie because it causes them to scrape themselves on rocks until they injure themselves. Finally, deer can also have a similar disease, chronic wasting disease, which has been known to infect deer in the United States and is something that hunters look out for. All of these diseases affect the nervous system. In the nervous system, it ends up causing holes in the brain tissue. This is spongiform encephalopathy, and when in cows, it's BSE. These holes in the brain tissue that you see in these images are a result of death of the neurons in those locations. The death of these brain cell areas leads to dementia and eventually death in humans, and in cows can lead to debilitating motor functions, causing them to stumble, not able to walk, and also eventually lead to death. What causes mad cow disease? The reason why we're spending an entire lecture on this one disease is that mad cow disease is caused by a completely different pathogen, one that prior to knowing about mad cow disease, we didn't even know could exist. When people think of pathogens, they usually think of bacteria or fungi, maybe in some cases protozoa, and of course there's viruses. And out of all of these, viruses are of course not alive. They are small molecule complexes that can replicate inside living cells. Mad cow disease is none of these. Not only is it none of these different types of pathogens, but it's also now known to be the smallest pathogen known to man. It is not a living organism. It is not a virus. It's even smaller than that. It is a single protein. This single protein is able to replicate itself inside living cells. Not only that, but it can be transmitted from cow to person, and from person to person, and from cow to cow. As this protein replicates inside brain tissue, it can lead to destruction of brain cells, spongiform encephalopathy, and death. The protein that causes this disease is called a prion. There are two different structures of the prion protein. The normal prion has an amino acid sequence that is similar to the pathogenic prion protein. But as you can see from these images, the normal prion protein, even though it has the same amino acid sequence, has a completely different secondary and tertiary structure as compared to the pathogenic version. I like to think of these as the good twin and the evil twin. And once the protein becomes the pathogenic or evil shape, it cannot go back to the normal shape. Now, the normal prion structure that you see here is found in every single person's brain tissue. That prion is required for normal brain activity. So all of us have that protein in our cells. The pathogenic structure that you see here is the one that can replicate. The normal structure cannot. The way the pathogenic structure replicates is all it has to do is physically touch the normal prion structure, and it can convert the normal structure into the pathogenic structure. So if you have a single pathogenic prion structure in your brain, if it contacts a normal prion that is already in your brain, it can convert it to the pathogenic form, and now you have two of those pathogenic molecules. These can go on and touch two other normal prion structures to form 4, and then 8, 16, 32, and you get the idea. So the way that prions replicate is just by touching the already existing normal structure. These prions are found in all mammalian brains, and so can transmit spongiform encephalopathy that way. What causes this disease to move from animal to animal? The proteins, as I mentioned, are found in nervous tissue. So you would need to get the brain tissue of a cow into your body in order to be infected with BSE. How did that happen? Well, it turns out that when cows are butchered by industrial processing plants, their brain tissue can end up getting on some of the machinery accidentally. And this brain tissue can then be transmitted to the meat or the muscle tissue. This is much more common and more likely to happen in ground up meat, such as ground beef for hamburgers, or in hot dogs or sausages. It's a lot less likely to have contaminating brain tissue in steaks because these are cut precisely from the muscle tissue itself. Unfortunately, these prion proteins, the pathogenic structures, are highly resistant to any means of destroying them. They are able to remain active, not alive, because these aren't living things, they're just molecules, but they can remain active throughout the cooking process when you're making sausages or steaks or hamburgers. You can get rid of them by setting them on fire and turning them into ash, but at that point we wouldn't be eating it. Unfortunately, it was the younger people, especially those in Great Britain, that were eating the meat pies, sausages, and hamburgers more often, thereby ingesting more of the pathogenic prion protein from the cows that were infected with BSE at the time. Older people that had more money to afford steaks and finer cuts of meat were not infected as much with the pathogenic protein structures. So BSE, which when acquired by a person is referred to as variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or VCJD, ended up killing over 150 people, nearly all of whom were from the United Kingdom and younger in age. Why was this so common with people who were young living in the UK? Well, as we covered, younger people were getting it more than older people because they were eating the cheaper cuts of meat that were more likely to contain contaminated brain tissue. But why were cows in the UK, so many cows in the UK, infected with BSE? Well, it turns out that BSE can be acquired by cows at a very, very, very rare rate naturally. 1 in 100 million or so. This is totally random and completely natural, And if it infects a single cow and that tissue is consumed by a few individuals, a few people, then those individuals could eventually develop CJD in their 70s or 80s when dementia and death are not that uncommon. But so many cows were infected with BSE in the 1980s and 90s that many young individuals ended up contracting the disease and dying fairly early. The reason why people in the UK were getting this was because many cows in the UK were infected with BSE. And the reason for that is that cows, it turns out, were eating unused parts of butchered cows. When cows are brought to slaughter in industrial manufacturing plants, the muscle tissue is provided back to the rancher, and the rest of the cow parts have to be disposed of. This includes bones and unused organs, like brain tissue, the pancreas, kidneys, and so forth. Many ranchers noticed that their cows were low in protein, and they had this excess tissue from butchered cows that they needed to get rid of. So what many ranchers started to do was to take the unused tissue from butchered cows, grind it up with grains and hay, and feed that to the rest of the cows in their ranch. This ended up being a cost-saving, common practice in the UK and started becoming popular in other areas around the world. Unfortunately, if even one of those cows randomly had developed BSE, it would then infect many other cows. And those cows would then go on to infect other cows through this cannibalistic process. Cows ended up eating the parts of other cows when really they are herbivores and shouldn't be eating meat at all. The consequence of all of this is that nearly 200,000 cows tested positive for BSE in the UK at that time. And that is what led to the deaths of over 150 people in the UK. There is currently a blood donation restriction for anyone who's lived in the UK for 6 months or more. The incubation period is years to decades, and we fully still don't understand how prion diseases work or are transmitted. And that's why there's a blood donation restriction, is because it's still many things are unknown. VCJD and BSE is also very hard to diagnose. The only way it can be really definitively diagnosed is with a brain biopsy, which means part of the brain tissue of either the person or the cow must be acquired and analyzed to determine if there's any VCJD or BSE. In some respects, it doesn't matter because there's currently no cure. In the next section, we're going to talk about how we prevent this disease from spreading and other related prion diseases.